Welcome back to Catastrophe Chronicles. I'm Katie Babbick, your co-pilot for today's journey into another forgotten corner of disaster history.
And I'm Arin Babbick, here to remind everyone that not all disasters make it into the history books, or even the in-flight safety video.
That's true. Today we're covering the story of Continental Airlines Flight 11 in 1962, not to be confused with the much more infamous Flight 11 of 2001. The earlier disaster didn't change much, didn't make headlines for long, and honestly has been mostly forgotten.
But that doesn't mean it isn't worth talking about. It's a story of sabotage and heartbreak.
Exactly. So fasten your seatbelt as we take you back to the skies of 1962. The drinks may be stiff, the seats uncomfortable, and the story unsettling, but that's why you're here, right?
Because nothing says relaxing flight like an unsolved mystery and a healthy dose of mid-century chaos.
So let's taxi down the runway and dive on in. Hi guys, welcome back. I hope everyone had a good week. Ours has been pretty awesome. Arin went back to work. The kids are back in school, which for us is homeschooling, so it doesn't actually mean peace in the house, but it does mean they have something to do besides video games, which is pretty cool.
It's true.
Thankfully, not a lot of crazy news out there going on.
Yeah, I'm just holding my breath.
Well, that's helpful and hopeful.
I don't know. The events of the last few years are just like, when's the next piece coming?
I don't know. I think the last couple of years haven't been too crazy. 2020, 2021 was definitely nutty, but it seems to have slowed down in a lot of ways. It's probably going to ramp back up here soon. But,
I do really hope that someone put the crystal skull back.
I'm a little worried about bird flu, but other than that, I think it'll be fine. I mean, it's fine. It's all good. There's a new movie or new miniseries out on Netflix that I watched this week called La Palma, which was really, really fun.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's a disaster miniseries. It's a Norwegian one.
Oh.
About volcanic eruption in the Canary Islands. And if you haven't seen it, it's like, I don't know what the word is, trending. It's one of the top 10 on Netflix.
Okay.
Total kick. I had a lot of fun with that. That was a good one. Have you read or done anything fun this week?
Well, I started my research for the next episode that I'm going to do.
Oh, so you picked?
I did.
Which one did you pick?
The USS Forstall fire.
Oh, the one I don't know about.
Yeah.
Nice. That'll be awesome. So we have, 6 weeks?
We'll see. Hopefully I get it done sooner than 6 weeks.
I believe in you. You can do this. Well, for this week, we are heading back to the 1960s.
Ooh.
This disaster took place in 1962. So the quote that I have for this week: failure saves lives. In the airline industry, every time a plane crashes, the probability of the next crash is lowered by that. And that's by Nassim Taleb. That was really fitting because it's very true. And it's a lot of what we like to talk about on this podcast is, bad things happen, terrible things. And hopefully, if people are doing it right, things change.
A lesson.
Yep. And we're never going to learn all the lessons we need to learn to keep tragedy from happening. But hopefully we can limit it at least a little bit.
Sure.
I mean, that's always the goal, right?
Yeah, it's funny. You say that, and that quote works very well for my upcoming episode, too.
Oh, good. Good. I mean, I think it works for a lot of disasters in general. We talked in a couple of different episodes about how, building codes are often all written in blood. A lot of aviation laws are written in blood. Obviously, fire codes are written in blood. A lot of the laws that we have and regulations that we have, they're written because disasters happen and we learn from them. Unfortunately, this one doesn't have actually a lot of, changes. So there's that. But
okay.
This is one of the first bombings of a jet airliner. And the flight was Flight 11. And it was really interesting doing research for it because, of course, the flight that crashed into the Pentagon was Flight 11.
Oh, so you got a lot of results for that.
Yeah, trying to find different information outside of the couple of books that I read became a little bit problematic because I couldn't just put Flight 11 into
right.
Google search. I had to, it's 1962 Continental Airlines Flight 11, because anything other than that was going to bring up the Pentagon. And that's a really not wonderful. That's a really fascinating story as well, but, not what we're doing here.
Right.
Definitely interesting tie, though, that this was one of the first bombings of a jet airliner, and then another Flight 11 ended up being part of, the biggest terrorist attack in history using airplanes.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's where we are. So let's talk a little bit about the 60s.
Yes, let's.
Hey, Mama, welcome to the 60s. Da, da, da. We played that song when we were making our drinks tonight.
Well, what are we drinking?
Oh, this is another Chat GPT creation. He called it, it called it the jet stream.
Oh, nice.
And
okay.
it's, I'm going to put the description in the the pod blog, but it was something about how the blue represents the blue skies, and it's got like lemonade and vodka and blue
Curacao.
I never say that right. I'll get there eventually. I'm not a heavy drinker enough to know what all the different alcohol names are. But it's good. It's tasty. And it's the jet stream, which is fitting because we're in the jet age, talking about jet planes.
I like it. It's tasty.
Yeah. So the 1960s. Here we are. It's the Cold War. Everyone's
hippies.
Nervous. And hippies. A lot of hippies. But, you know, the United States and the Soviet Union, they were, I don't want to say duking it out because, you know, they weren't duking it out was kind of the point. They were more doing a dick measuring contest throughout the course of post-World War II all the way up until the end of the Cold War with Reagan and all that stuff.
And a lot of crazy tension and
a lot of anxiety.
Witch hunts, blacklists.
Just a lot of anxiety. I mean, everyone was afraid of the bomb, right?
Yeah.
I remember talking to my parents who, you know, really were in their heyday in the 60s. Or at least, you know, in school in the 60s. And they remember both of them doing nuclear bomb drills where they would go under their desk if the bomb went off.
Same thing you do for
an earthquake.
For an earthquake.
At least with an earthquake, you had a chance of surviving it, though. Like, that was always interesting to me, hearing them talk about that growing up, where they would hide under the desks from a nuclear bomb. And I mean, I guess it gives them something to do. So they feel like they have some control, but I just can't imagine it would be very effective. But at any rate, people were scared. People were nervous. 1962 is the same year that the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. It happened a few months after this disaster took place, but to just kind of give you an idea of where we're at in the time frame, we're just a few months before the Cuban Missile Crisis. Everyone's worried John F. Kennedy is president, and we're doing all the things. We're also in the middle of the Civil Rights Movement.
What a time.
So the Civil Rights Movement in the United States was one of the fights for racial equality. People were trying to kind of overturn these Jim Crow laws because after the Civil War, not enough changed in terms of racial tensions and how Black and brown people were being treated. So some things were starting to shift there. There was some movement. There's definitely a lot of people trying to do something about it. And that added to both the sense of optimism and the sense of anxiety.
Yeah.
This was also right in the middle of the space race. John F. Kennedy had promised to put a man on the moon by the end of the 60s. So there was a ton of technological advances happening all around, but particularly in the fields of aviation, space technology. The U.S. was in direct competition with the Soviet Union for the space race. There was quite a bit of dick measuring in terms of that.
Right. And then the Soviets put up Sputnik.
That's what I was going to say. In 1957, the Soviets put Sputnik up, being the first country in space, which triggered a lot of the, you know, oh no, they can't be number one, so we're going to be the first ones to put a man on the moon.
America.
NASA was written essentially a blank check to get this stuff figured out. And we're actually going to be doing, or I want to do, I've been in the process of doing research on a 3-part series of space disasters. I want to do one. Yeah, I think it'll be fun. I want to do one on like miscellaneous disasters, pre-Challenger and Columbia and the space shuttles. And then I want to do one on specifically the Challenger and then one on the Columbia. Because there's a ton of interesting stuff about NASA. NASA's amazing. And especially in the 1960s, I think NASA lived up to a lot of its potential. But NASA also is like a lot of really nerdy people stuck in its ways and doesn't do a great job with seeing the big picture. But they were doing the work. In 1961, Alan Shepard became the first American in space, and he was followed by John Glenn in 1962, the year we're talking about, being the first American and the first person to orbit the Earth in space.
Right.
Big jumps.
Yep.
To kind of shift it a little bit, this was also an era where life insurance scams were becoming like really common. Life insurance was apparently like incredibly easy to get. They had things like vending machines in airports that you could buy life insurance right before you got on the flight.
From a vending machine.
From a vending machine. It would be $250 to buy somewhere between $60,000 and $75,000 worth of flight insurance for one way. You had to buy it each way. You couldn't buy it for a round trip.
Oh, wow. What a racket.
Isn't that crazy? And there was a bunch of different ways that you could get life insurance, but with so many different ways to get life insurance, there were also a lot of people scamming and, doing terrible things to get life insurance to their friends and family or even to themselves. And this was leading to a lot of discussion about trying to regulate the industry more and trying to do things to prevent life insurance fraud, which I thought was interesting, and it is applicable to the story. So
Really?
it is.
Okay.
So that's kind of where we are. The mood in the United States in 1962, again, was a lot of optimism mixed with a lot of anxiety. We have the looming threat of nuclear war, ongoing racial tensions, and concerns about the dangers of modern technology.
Yeah.
Aviation, space technology, all these different things. So there's a real sense of unease along with that, real potential that was going on.
Fear of radiation and all the unknown.
Yeah, it was really a time of just like a lot of transition and technological advancement. And then, social and political unrest. Just a lot of, again, so many of these disasters are just dichotomies. There's the yin and the yang everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk a little bit about the aviation industry. I want to go into that a little bit deeper than the other stuff because this is about plane disaster, about the aviation industry.
It's fitting.
Yeah, this is in the middle of what was called the jet age. Have you heard of the jet age?
I have now.
This is the real push forward for these big jet airliners, not small planes. This is where people are really starting to use air travel more consistently. Certainly not as much as they do today, but it was becoming more and more common. We were getting more and more airlines that could carry, 100 plus passengers at a time, not just little dinky planes that could carry 30, maybe 40.
And this is also when it was becoming glamorous to fly.
Yes.
And the hip thing.
Yep. And there were definitely some airlines that really, like Continental, that pushed that vibe, that luxury airlines. A lot of them were called, the good ones were called the champagne flights, which the flight we're going to talk about today was a champagne flight. Very fancy. This was the introduction of, these newer and faster jets, including things like the Boeing 707, which is the type of plane we're going to be talking about today, and then also the Douglas DC-8, and they really transformed air travel. With these changes in air travel, with this increased commercial airline things happening, there was also an increased number of accidents and an increased number of problems that were going on with airplanes. There were far more deaths in the 1960s on airlines than there were today. It was far more common to crash on an airplane, die on an airplane than it was today. And that's
comforting.
Yeah. It increased a lot of fear. A lot of people were nervous. A lot of people had a lot of unease about these. There was a couple of major crashes before this disaster that I just wanted to mention. One of them was the United Airlines Flight 629, which happened in 1955 and killed quite a few people. Then there was the mainliner Denver, which was a Douglas DC-6B aircraft that was blown up on November 1st, 1955 by a dynamite bomb. Yep.
By a dynamite bomb.
Placed in a checked bag.
Why? Why was it blown up?
I'm not sure, but it was blown up.
Okay.
So that's what happened. The FAA was finally established. I say finally, like it was a foregone conclusion. It was established in 1958. So we're only 4 years post the FAA, for the United States, the Federal Aviation Administration existing. And they were starting to really try and take steps to regulate air traffic, improve those safety standards. But accidents and issues like pilot error were still really, really contributing to the perception that aviation could be dangerous because, it was.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
It was more dangerous than driving in a car anyway.
Sounds kind of like the Wild West.
It was a lot like the Wild West. That's a really good way to look at it and to think about it. It was the Wild West of airline times from everything I read and from what I can understand. Boeing 707 is the plane we're going to talk about today the most. The prototype for it was first flown in 1954. So it was a really new plane on the market by 1962.
Okay.
The very first 707-120 flew with passengers on it in December of 1957. It wasn't the first commercial jetliner that was in service, but it was the first one to be widespread. And its production and its use is often credited with really the beginning of the jet age, the end of the 50s, early 60s. It also established Boeing as a dominant airline manufacturer. In 2025, we can't imagine airlines without Boeing, but before the 707, Boeing primarily made military aircraft.
Interesting.
And after World War II ended, Korea ended, and now we're kind of before Vietnam. Vietnam tensions are starting. There's problems in Nam, but the war that involved the United States hadn't broken out yet. I mean, the war in Vietnam had, but the United States hadn't joined it yet. So Boeing was kind of in between wars
in between
to
gigs.
Make planes for. So it was kind of moving to this more commercial aspect, and the 707 was a big part of that. Whether or not the 707 would be profitable was really far from certain. It was very much a gamble by Boeing. It's a gamble that ultimately paid off.
Okay.
But it was a gamble. So that's where we are.
All right.
Let's talk about May 22nd, 1962.
Do it.
Are you ready to
Take off.
To go? You ready to take off?
Yes.
At 7 o'clock on Tuesday, May 22nd, 1962, the Boeing 707-124 with the registration number N70775 arrived into Chicago O'Hare Airport as flight number 10 from Los Angeles, California.
All right.
This flight was known as the Champagne Flight, and it was due to basically turn back around and go back to Los Angeles, only this time as Flight 11. On its way to
A fancy flight.
A fancy flight, very fancy. On its way to Los Angeles, it was due to stop in Kansas City. That flight should have taken an hour from Chicago to Kansas City.
Okay.
It's now known as Flight 11. The crew turned over. It was now captained by Captain Fred Gray, who was a really well-regarded pilot. He had 23 years of experience at this time, 23,000 hours of flying time, which sounds bananas to me. I'm not sure if that's... he was really loved. 2,600 of those were on the Boeing 707. And again, I'm just going to remind everyone, Boeing 707 was only 5 years old. So 2,600 hours by 1962.
Yeah, he
that
knew
seems
his
like a
aircraft.
lot. And he knew the one he was on for sure. His co-pilot was Edward Sullivan, who had 14,500 flying hours with 600 in a 707. Fred Gray, like I said, was just an exceptional pilot. And one of the things I really loved reading about is he was known for always wearing white shoes and having a red carnation in his jacket pocket.
Aww.
And I love that mental image. That's just so 1960s. Champagne flight pilot. You can just picture it in your head with his little pilot hat and everything. And he was universally loved by everyone who worked with him and his kids and his family. Fred Gray was a good guy. So he was due to take off on Flight 11, head over to Kansas City before heading over to Los Angeles. He had to change the flight path slightly due to weather that was going on between Chicago and Kansas City. There was a number of different storms kind of rolling through the area. That area of the United States is known for thunderstorms, especially in May. The spring storms are really, really common. He made the decision to fly at 39,000 feet instead of 29,000 feet. He was going to deviate a little bit from the flight path, but he had it well in hand. He knew the area. He knew his craft. This was not unusual. It was immediately approved by the higher-ups for him to change it, and there you go. At 8 o'clock, there were 35 passengers that joined the 8 crew members on the Boeing 707 for Flight 11. These passengers came from 20 different states and 3 foreign countries. Now, I don't remember exactly how many seats this plane had, but it had over 100. So it was a really small flight.
Yeah, not
a lot of seats full. And I found that kind of bananas.
Yeah, every time we fly, it's packed.
Well, I don't think that flight would take off today. I think they would deem it as too underfull.
Yeah,
or too low passengers and not worth the money.
Right.
In 1962, it took off with 35 passengers.
Crazy.
29 of those passengers were veterans. 16 of them were from World War II.
Oh, wow.
That always kind of blows my mind when you're talking about the 50s and the 60s, that there's World War II veterans that aren't in the very later years of their lives. They're in a lot of their prime still. So 16 veterans from World War II, 3 from Korea, and 1 who was active duty in uniform. The plane ended up delaying slightly because there was 2 passengers that almost missed it, and they had to run, and they had to reopen the door to be let onto the flight at the last minute.
Okay.
Something else that wouldn't happen today.
Yeah.
I just include it because it's so not
what
our
if they shut the
current
door,
experience.
you're not getting on that now.
It's so not what our experience is today. But they did. They let these last 2 passengers on, and then they took off. They took off at 8:35. The flight was airborne on its way to Kansas City with only those few weather concerns. Everything else was looking great. At 9:01, Captain Gray requests that Chicago Center send a radar picture of the squall line that he needs to pass in Iowa, and they send it over.
Mm-hmm.
At 9:02, controllers in Waverly are tracking Flight 11 from Chicago and tells the captain that he can expect to actually encounter 3 squall lines. Frank Gray adjusts to deal with it and is ready to move forward. By 9:10, Captain Gray reports that Flight 11 passed around the storm cell, and Waverly's controller let him know that he's clear for the rest of the flight and there's no further storms threatening the flight path. At 9:14, Gray begins a normal descent from 39,000 feet, approximately 1,000 feet per minute, since there's no more storms. He no longer has to fly at 39,000 feet. He can go back down to that 29. At 9:16, Waverly calls Kansas City Center for Captain Gray because he's had a bit of trouble contacting them. This is normal.
Okay.
At the time for the flight center to call the next one, because they're transferring from Chicago airspace to Kansas City airspace the flight controllers in Kansas City need to start tracking him on radar.
Yes.
And he couldn't get a hold of them. So the Waverly or Chicago Flight Center got a hold of Kansas City for him.
Yeah. Got it.
At 9:17, the Kansas City controller can see Flight 11 on its radar screen for a brief moment and is tracking it, and then suddenly it disappears.
Oh.
He tries to do a few sweeps for it to find it, but there's nothing. There's nothing on the Waverly controller's panel either. Both of them are screaming at this point into their microphones for Flight 11, Captain Gray, Flight 11, come in. But there's no response. Flight 11 disappeared at 9:17 and 7 seconds Central Standard Time.
Okay.
Junior Johnson had just locked up his Shield gas station when he sees what he thinks is a flash of lightning in the sky, even though the storms that had played the evening earlier had passed. He's on the Iowa-Missouri border.
All right.
Right near where Captain Gray would have been flying Flight 11. In Cincinnati, at the telephone exchange, Marjorie Jones also sees a flash of blue light so bright that it looks like daylight for a moment. She thinks it looks more like fireworks than lightning, though.
Okay, that's not good.
Nope, it's not looking good. A B-47 Stratojet bomber flying from Forbes Air Base in Topeka, Kansas, is flying around at the time, and the commander sees a bright flash in the sky just ahead of his position. He records the time and weather in his log and notes the place. It's 9:17 at Lake Wapallo in Iowa-Davis County, 35 miles northeast of Centerville. There are numerous reports of a loud boom throughout the area and numerous reports of a bright flash in the sky.
Okay.
Got any guesses yet?
Something went wrong.
Nothing's going good right now. The booms seem to be the loudest near Shuey Farm with its fields of alfalfa hay and cows. The sound is like rumbling, rolling thunder and lasts around 10 seconds there, with the ground trembling and the windows shaking.
Ooh.
At 9:20, Leo and Barbara Craver and Jack and Judy Morris are driving home from a lovely dinner out. 5 miles south of Centerville, Iowa, they see a scattering of debris in the road, including a large piece of metal. Craver and Morris, the two men in the car, stop to examine the metal in the headlights of the car. It's aluminum, 3 feet long, 6 inches wide, green on one side, and the other side has smooth, round rivets. Now, Leo Craver is a World War II veteran who worked on accident investigations during his time in the war.
Oh, interesting.
He knew immediately that this was a piece of aircraft just based on those rivets alone.
Yeah.
He decides immediately that the next thing they need to do is take it to the police station. This is not the era of cell phones.
Yeah. You have to go there.
And this is the middle of Iowa and Missouri. So
Middle
there's
of-
not a lot of buildings either. Not a lot of easily accessible phones. So they take it straight to the police station. At the police station, Deputy Police Chief Curtis Green calls the Centerville airport to see if there had been any accidents, if there had anything that had happened. But news hadn't reached them yet because Flight 11 came from Chicago and was going to Kansas City. It wasn't involved with Centerville Airport.
Oh.
So they didn't know. They hadn't gotten a call. They didn't know there had been a crash. So they were told, no, there's no accidents. There's nothing going on. The Appanoose, that area county sheriff, Paul Thomas, is there as well. And he and Leo are really old friends. And Thomas trusts and knows Leo. He knows his background. So if Leo says this is a piece of an aircraft, Sheriff Thomas believes him. He rides up with Leo and they get in the car and they go back out to where Leo found it. When they get there, they find that there's dozens of other people out on the road at this point with flashlights moving through the dark, and they almost look like fireflies. They're picking up things like napkins, a cup, a spoon, pieces of metal, lots and lots of different pieces of debris that are just spread through the area. So they start looking too. And they pretty quickly find this piece of paper with the words Continental Airlines Flight 11, Chicago to Kansas City. And on it is also a seat number.
A ticket stub.
A ticket stub. So we know for sure now.
Oh, yeah.
This plane has crashed. The sheriff knows, but you gotta, go through some things to figure it out. One of the patrolmen there, as soon as they find this piece of paper, immediately calls back to the police station on the radio, and they call Des Moines, which is the main police center, I guess, for the area. And at Des Moines, at the police station there has now been a report that a passenger airline with 37 passengers and 8 crew is overdue in Kansas City, and it's missing from radar. Its last known location is somewhere near Centerville, Iowa, which is not too far from the Unionville area that they're in right now, finding all these pieces of debris.
Okay.
At the same time as Des Moines is letting them know that, the Centerville police assistant, Curtis Green, the first one they talked to, is calling out over the radio that they believe they have a plane down in the south of town. People are starting to figure out what's going on here. They don't know exactly what happened, but they know it's not good. By 10:15, calls are starting to go out all over Centerville and that area of Iowa. Go south of town and start looking. There's a jetliner down and it needs to be found so that hopefully we can save some lives. The calls go to the fire department, the police station, the civil defense members. They call for anyone with a truck because this is, again, it's Iowa. It's the center of the country. If you don't know the United States and you don't know this area, especially in the 60s, people were willing to get up and help. Everyone pitched in, especially in these smaller towns and these smaller areas. They're also calling funeral homes and getting some of those morgue things ready. Neighbors are starting to call neighbors, and volunteers are getting up and heading out to help. Newspapers are also being called, and the press is starting to arrive, both to cover the event and also a number of the press helped with the search to figure out where this airliner was.
All right.
Doctors are being called. There weren't a ton of doctors in the area, but the two main ones were Dr. Ritter and Dr. Judd, and they're on their way out. Basically, the whole of Centerville and pretty much everyone in this small area has turned up. There are search parties already heading out from the exit from where the first piece of the crash was found by Leo Craver with walkie-talkies and flashlights, kind of making their way through the trees in these farm fields. People are all over the place, everywhere, searching. The discoveries that they're making were just incredibly ominous from the very beginning. 2 blood-stained pillows, sandwiches with blood on them, pieces of metal, an escape hatch door, but no sign of the aircraft itself and no bodies or victims.
Okay.
At 10:17, 2 FBI agents from Waterloo arrive at the Waverly station and start questioning the air traffic controller there to kind of figure out what was going on. What was the weather like? Are you sure it's actually gone? What do we do here?
Yeah.
What's going on? 10:30 is when 2 DC offices were informed of what was going on. The first one was the Civil Aeronautics Board, also known as the CAB, and the Federal Aviation Agency, the FAA. Mm-hmm. And they are informed of the disappearance of Flight 11 and the location of the craft's last transmitted position, which was, again, somewhere near Centerville, Iowa. At 11 o'clock, the big CAB team of 6 experts leaves D.C. for Centerville, Iowa. George Van Epps is leading. He's the CAB's head of safety investigation, and he is the nation's absolute leading expert on Boeing 707s.
Okay.
He knows what he's doing. At the same time, Dr. Ritter is looking over a piece of metal found on the road, and he is able to identify it as a piece of a 707. It's pretty obvious at this point that this wreckage is from Flight 11. Yeah. There are a number of restaurants in the area, little cafes and stuff, that are stepping up, like Burton Bill's Cafe and Lyle Wells Dairy, sending out coffee to the crews, sending out sandwiches, because we're now at about almost 2 hours post that first piece being found.
Yeah.
About 2 hours from the crash landing and an hour and a half from that first piece being found. By 11:30, there's a group of 200 some odd people moving south through the countryside, searching, with Sheriff Paul Thomas at the lead. And this group includes Leo Carver. The National Guard is also being pulled up and put on standby, preparing a morgue at the National Guard Armory in Centerville.
Okay.
People are coming.
Yeah.
And a lot of people. But still, no wreckage, no bodies. Nothing's been found yet.
Why are they just searching south?
There's a trail of debris. But they're also not just searching south. It's that big group of people is kind of moving through the debris they find and moving south, but they're not the only ones out. There are more than those 200 searching. Okay. The searchers are all told to note any debris that they find, but to leave it where it is, untouched. To the note that we were saying before, the search is going really slow. The debris is being found, but there's no aircraft and there's no bodies. There's a lot of blood all over these pieces of wreckage, though. The discoveries are starting to get bigger. A large inner door labeled to be opened at takeoff and landing, an entire lavatory with blood all over it, an 8-foot section of the fuselage. There's a newspaperman on the scene who's helping with the search, but also going back to make calls to various news agencies to let them know what's going on, keeping them updated. And his statement remains the same over and over and over again at this point. He just keeps calling and saying, the hills and darkness of the Iowa and Missouri border still hold their tragic secret. That's a direct quote where he was just calling that back over and over. People search for hours. Officers and sheriffs go to folks' home and call out the men and even older teenagers to come and help with the search for the plane wreckage. By 2:30 in the morning, there's over 700 people searching for Flight 11 on both sides of the Iowa-Missouri border. There's ambulances, fire trucks, highway officers, doctors, press, and just general volunteers. It's around this time at 2:30 in the morning that the first team from the FAA arrives and joins in on the search as well. They find a trail of torn metal and bloody airplane blankets, and finally, the first body.
Okay.
2:30 in the morning. It's bananas to me how long it took. It makes sense. They didn't have aircraft that they could, easily fly slowly over the area and search for it. It's in this small town area, but that's a long time.
It's also, that stuff gets spread over a wide area.
It does, but still, that's a long time. And it's kind of crazy to me to think a plane can crash. People can know it crashed. They can hear it. They can see it. And it can still it crashed at 9:17 and it's 2:30 in the morning. So we're at 5 hours post crash. And that's when they find the first body. And his first body is a man who's hanging in a tree near an alfalfa hayfield. The man's eyes are open, his intestines are exposed, his clothes have been entirely ripped from his body except for his socks, and he has an identity bracelet on his wrist that reads Dottie. Just horrific. Plane crash victims it's horrific, and I'm sorry in advance there's some gruesome in this for sure.
I'm curious as to how.
How what?
Well, we've got lots of items covered in blood before any body is found.
Yep.
That's a lot of blood.
It is.
And then no clothes, just socks.
Well, the no clothes is actually pretty common.
Is it?
In a plane crash or an explosion. Yeah. I don't want to say pressure. What's the word?
The force?
The force of the wind
wave?
blowing can rip your clothing off and rip open your intestines. It can rip off body parts, but it definitely can rip off your clothing pretty easily. That's why a lot of times when there's like an explosion or somebody gets hit by a car, they'll get knocked completely out of their shoes. I don't know if you remember that kid it was on a Boeing jet. The side of the jet or the door fell off and his mom held him in the seat and his shirt got ripped off, but his mom was holding him. There's a video of it if you haven't seen it.
Well, that's wild.
But his whole shirt got ripped off from the pressure of the air flowing out of the jet. So like clothing being gone is really common in crashes like this and an explosion.
Okay, so less mysterious.
No, not mysterious.
I'm sure they were freaking out, the people who were doing the search at this point, though.
So the people who found that first body were the FAA investigators. I'm sure they were very upset and very sad, but they also were experienced more than some of the other farmers and volunteers that would have been in the area. So I don't know if they would have been shocked, but I'm sure they were very upset. Very sad.
Yeah.
Lester and Ronnie were renters on the Shuey farm, and they were called out by the sheriff department. I'll go out, look, see what you can find. And they headed off in the direction of a loud boom that they had heard earlier that evening. Around 2:45 in the morning, they are the first people to find the broken wreckage of Flight 11 in the alfalfa field, not too far behind their home. The field is silent with the exception of one poor soul still moaning.
Oh, no.
Inside of the wreckage. Ronnie runs out into the road. He manages to flag down a car that has 2 newspaper men in it, and he ends up going with the car, get the help to come back to the field.
So this guy's been in there for 5 hours.
5 hours. And still in there because they can't really easily get to him. Like, they let him know that he's there, but they can't get in, and they need to go and get the help to get to him because they can't pull him out because of where he's at.
Oh, man.
Terry Bunnell and Jean Crawford also find the wreckage not too long after them, and Jean heads back to her house. She had a full-on telephone in her house that she was able to use to call to get help to come. At 3:30, Ronnie reaches the main bulk of the rescue crew in this newspaper guy's car. The newspaper man shouts at them, "This kid and his dad found the wreck!" And the entire crowd, just in a mass, follows them to the wreck site, going through fields, just tire tracks going everywhere, trying to get there as fast as they could. And they're not moving that fast because it's almost like a traffic jam of everyone rushing as quickly as they could to get there. At 3:35, the first help arrives at the wreckage site. It's basically just one officer who has been out searching with his 7-year-old son. The officer is Bob Fowler, and he's with his son, Robert, which I don't know exactly how that worked out, but he's out at 2:45 or I guess 3:30 in the morning searching with his kid, and they're the first ones to arrive. For whatever reason, I'm assuming Bob was trying to see what was going on and Robert got away, but Robert got away, and he ended up climbing into the wreckage. He climbs the little boy, the little 7-year-old boy.
Oh, 7.
He ends up climbing up the airline wing to kind of see what was going on. Oh, this makes me sad. He climbs up the existing wing and he finds Captain Fred Gray inside the cockpit, and Captain Fred Gray is in very not great condition. The oxygen masks are down. The emergency checklist is out. A number of the instruments have been used in an emergency way. The landing gear is down. Captain Fred is not. The little boy, Robert, we're going to talk about him more later in the story, held that memory with him.
Traumatized.
Yeah, forever.
That's some therapy.
And one of the things he talks about in later days, when he wrote about it as an adult, was that he's sitting there on the swing with this just broken body in front of him. And around him in the countryside, the birds are singing. The stars are out. It's a beautiful, calm, peaceful night. I mean, we live in the South. We know what it looks like after a thunderstorm. It's beautiful after a thunderstorm. And they're in the middle of nowhere with no lights, with stars twinkling, the little bugs, little birds, because it's just the sun's going to rise soon. Just really, really awful. 4:30 is when the first rescue vehicles are finally able to make it to the scene. So the ambulances and the people who can actually help this poor man who's still alive in this jet plane. Dr. Ritter is among them, and he takes command. At this point, the man has stopped moaning for the most part, and they all have kind of assumed that...
Gray?
No, we don't know who the man who was moaning was. Captain Gray is definitely dead.
Okay.
Robert found him. His body is not in good condition. He is not alive.
Oh, I thought you said he was in rough shape, but I thought maybe he was...
I meant his body's in rough shape, and we're going to talk a little bit about the condition his body was in later. He was not alive. There is moaning coming from somewhere inside the plane at 3:30, but by 4:30, that moaning has for the most part stopped.
Okay.
So the assumption is that whoever it was passed away waiting for help to come in that time frame. Dr. Ritter is the main doctor for Centerville, so he is the one who's kind of in charge of all of these different things. Because it's such a small area, he's also the chief medical examiner for Centerville, so he is really the man in charge when it comes to the victims at this point. He tells the National Guard to string a rope 30 feet away from the aircraft in a barrier so that all the medical personnel can work. And there's blood everywhere. This is not a good scene. Most of the passengers are still strapped into their seats, their heads pitched forward and crushed into the seats in front of them.
Oh, God.
Dr. Ritter begins diligently checking every single body for signs of life, moving as fast as he can, which isn't that fast, through the absolute carnage. At 4:40, the FAA investigators are arriving, led by Najib Halabi, who's the head of the FAA, and 6 executives of Continental Airlines, along with 15 FBI agents with more to follow, including their supervisor, Mark Felt. Do you recognize that name at all?
It sounds very familiar.
You might recognize his nickname. He earned it 10 years later. Deep Throat.
No way.
Now, we didn't know he was Deep Throat until 2005, but Mark Felt eventually became Deep Throat. When Richard Nixon was, pulling his nonsense, his Watergate scandal, Mark Felt was there to stop the bullshit. That's Mark Felt. He is in charge of this FBI team that's there. They are there at this point primarily to just help facilitate. They're not in charge of the investigation. They're just there to lend a hand because, again, I keep saying it, but it's a small town. It's a small area. There's not a lot of resources in this part of the country, in this part of the United States.
Right.
So the FBI is out there to help out, make sure they can get things going. At this point, Dr. Charles Judd, who is Unionville, Missouri's main doctor, is also called to the scene because turns out the flight crashed in Missouri, not in Iowa. And at this point, it's mostly Iowa and Centerville that has been preparing and getting these things together. There are people in Unionville that have been helping, but Unionville itself is not prepared for the disaster. It's mostly Iowa because everyone kind of thought it had crashed in Iowa.
And then they followed the trail.
And then they found it. I mean, it was right. The border's right there.
Yeah.
But it crashed in Missouri. So the main doctor in the town there, Dr. Judd, is called. At 5:05, lead undertaker L.J. Johnson is told not to touch any of the bodies or remove them from the scene until the inspection teams from the FAA, FBI, and Continental Airlines are formed and arrive and are able to investigate and see what was going on. This is pretty much immediately discarded because at 5:06, as Dr. Ritter is moving through the dead, he hears a moan.
Oh, no.
Halfway down the right side of the fuselage. It's a young man. He's lying across 3 different seats. He was briefly lucid when Dr. Ritter was able to get to him, and he told him that his name was Takiko Nakano, and he was able to ask for water. Despite having no external bleeding, he was clearly in rough condition. He was not not doing well. So
Yeah.
they did their best to extricate him as fast as possible, load him into an ambulance, and he was taken to Centerville St. Joseph Mary's Hospital at 5:30 in the morning. There were no other survivors,
Oh.
no other human survivors on this plane crash.
What? Humans are what?
Dr. Ritter, it's coming later, Dr. Ritter continues his grim task, and the FAA, FBI, and Continental examiners show up and are able to start taking photographs of the wreckage and the bodies to start their investigation to figure out what the hell happened.
Yeah. Now this is before the black box.
No.
No, they had black boxes on the
Well,
plane?
they had the flight recorder. I don't know if that's exactly the same thing as the black box, but they had the flight recorder,
Okay.
which we are going to talk about. Near the front of the plane, the bodies are in complete and total disarray. Many of them are dismembered. They're tumbled all over each other. Some of them have shrapnel embedded in them. The limbs of bodies, well, one of the descriptions mentioned something along the lines of there were limbs of bodies, a severed head sticking out of the ground like vegetables.
Oh, wow.
It was bad. And just on a side note, a couple of years ago, I was looking into Malaysian plane crash 17,
Okay.
which we probably won't do an episode on, to be completely honest, because I accidentally stumbled on this blog that had pictures of
Oh,
the victims.
yeah.
And I think I spent 10 seconds looking at them and then realized that even for me, that's too much.
Yeah.
It was too much. And I still occasionally have nightmares with those pictures in it. So I'm really, really careful. And I encourage everyone else to be very careful when you're looking up plane crashes to not just look like at the image search on Google, because that might give you an idea of the area, but you also might be scarred for life, because it is what happens in a plane crash is it's horrific.
Yeah.
And that's about as gruesome as I'm going to get tonight, I think. But I think it's important that you know these are not clean, happy deaths. They are thankfully pretty instantaneous,
Yeah.
but it's brutal. In the main body of the aircraft, the impact was clearly lighter. There's no dismemberment here. All of the victims are still in their seats. They're in pretty good condition, comparatively, at least to the front of the plane. The ground had imprints from the landing gear, showing that the pilots had tried to land the plane, or at least got the landing gear out. So they were alive up until the moment of impact. The FBI at this point is requested to form what's called a disaster squad. So no longer just helping out the local law enforcement, but creating a squad that is specifically trained in forensics and body identifications in
Okay.
hard to identify cases, which
Now, you say, sorry, I'm going to go back a little bit. You say that there, the ground has these marks from the landing gear,
Mhm.
but how far, because you said previously that part of the fuselage, like an 8-foot section of it, was found prior to finding the main body of the aircraft. How far away was that?
So we're going to get into this over the course of it, but the entire debris field of this crash was about 40 miles. The plane's
Jesus.
tail came off, and then the front of the plane, dive bombed at that point. One of the wings was sheared off. There are, again, we're going to talk about this more, but there's bodies littered throughout
Okay.
this, and they're littered in like farm fields in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
So that's why it was so hard to find. And a big part of why it was hard to find, this is considered the main part of the wreck, but it's definitely not the whole plane. It's probably like 30, 40% of the plane, and the rest of it is spread over the course of around 40 miles. At this point, bodies are starting to be removed carefully. There's a bit of a kerfuffle about where they should go. Iowa already had an emergency morgue formed by the National Guard, but the crash happened in Putnam, Missouri, near Unionville, so Missouri had jurisdiction. Dr. Judd, at one point, threatened to shoot the tires out of vehicles that were taking the victims to Iowa because they were under his jurisdiction, which I think is a bit crazy, but
Why would you be arguing about a thing like this?
I mean, you know how it goes with these things. The whole, you don't have jurisdiction, it's my jurisdiction.
It's a power trip.
It is definitely a power trip. But Dr. Judd,
stupid.
I think in a lot of ways he redeemed himself. So
Okay.
I tend to forgive it. This kerfuffle, though, ended up with them calling the Missouri Attorney General, a man named Thomas Eagleton. Do you recognize the name at all?
Sounds vaguely familiar.
You might not recognize it, but people who were alive in the 60s in the United States probably recognize the name because he ended up being George McGovern's vice presidential candidate. You remember George McGovern?
Again, vaguely.
Obviously, he didn't win. He was running against Nixon in Nixon's
How?
1972 election bid, the one that Watergate happened
Ooh.
because of. And he ended up having to drop out of the election entirely, and is probably a big part of why McGovern lost. Well, at least part of it, because he, I guess, had depression. And when it was found out, it was such a scandal, because that's what was a scandal back then compared to today.
Oh, wow.
It's a lot more to be a scandal today. So he dropped out. And McGovern, I forget who he ended up having as his presidential candidate, but they didn't end up winning. Nixon ended up winning 49 states in 1972.
Oh, man.
Isn't that bananas?
That's a lot. Yeah.
We talk about states today and how elections go today. Nixon won 502 electoral votes,
Woo.
49 states,
That
and then
is an
resigned
actual-
2 years later.
there's a windfall right there.
That was crazy. That right. Anyways, that was a side note. I found that bananas. So with the location of the morgue changing from Iowa to Missouri, they quickly had to find a building to put a morgue in, because
Yeah.
they didn't have an emergency morgue. And they quickly settled on John Ryle's garage, which is prepared by volunteers to house the bodies. And it was chosen because it adjoins this building called the W.E. Ross Building, which was straight up commandeered for offices for all of these various officials, officers, FBI agents, FIA people, CAB people, journalists coming in and descending onto this small area of the country in these wee hours of the morning after following this crash. So everything can kind of be in one centralized place. At 6 a.m, the sun finally rose to a beautiful spring morning. Beautiful spring morning, with the exception of the brutal carnage in the Shuey fields, with the aircraft that had been ripped in two and its tail section that was still missing.
Oh, man.
Yeah. Hordes of people are showing up from all of these different agencies, all of these different papers, all of these different places. And at 6:45 in the morning, the very last victim, Flight 11, died in the hospital when Takehiko Nakano passed away in Centerville's St. Joseph Mercy Hospital. He was unable to speak lucidly in English while he was there, and therefore was unable to provide any insight on what had happened during that fateful crash. His death certificate read irreversible shock due to trauma in an airplane accident due to hemorrhage and other injuries. And on a random side note, a nun at the hospital ended up baptizing him because she thought she heard him say that he was a Christian but not baptized. Which I thought was kind of okay.
I think she just baptized him.
Okay, Jan. Okay. That morning, when the Unionville public school buses started to shuttle its children to school, including Ronnie, who had found the wreckage late that previous evening,
Oh, poor kid.
he got on the bus, and on his way to pick up other kids, it drove by this copse of trees that had other bodies hanging in them that they could see.
No. Traumatized the whole school bus full of
Traumatized
kids.
the entire school bus full of kids.
God.
Oh, horrific. So 40 miles northwest of the wreckage as this day starts, other grim and bloody wreckage is starting to be found. The aircraft itself came down at a 45-degree angle, and the whole front portion exploded from the force of impact. The flight crew initiated the required emergency descent procedures. They donned their smoke masks due to the dense fog that had formed in the cabin immediately after decompression. Following the separation of the tail, the remaining aircraft pitched nose down violently. The engines tore off and ended up buried multiple feet into the ground throughout the course of this debris field.
Oh, man.
After the engines tore off, it spun and spun and spun until it finally hit the ground.
Fuck.
This is pretty brutal, so trigger warning here. Apparently, by the time they were starting to really get the bodies off of this plane, most of the wreckage and bodies were already covered in maggots because it was spraying and
God.
just... Oh, that scene was horrific. There were pieces of the plane crash found as far away as Cincinnati.
How far is that?
Again, a little over 40 miles. Now, these are little things like papers and stuff, but they were verified as being part of the crash, and there were pieces of it found as far away. Because the plane literally ripped in two. The tail section ripped off. The engines fell off when the plane, started diving down. The plane started spinning. A wing fell off. This is all happening over the course of it diving through. So there's just wreckage everywhere. It's not like it hit the ground. It fell apart in the sky.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was anticipating with the booms you were talking about, the flash of light.
And we're going to talk about what happened to it. But I wanted to tell the full story as people lived it, because I thought that was interesting.
Because I'm really, really fucking curious.
You're welcome. At 9 a.m, Dr. Charles Judd and Lester Cook are starting to surveil the area in an Army helicopter to find the 7 bodies that were not inside of the fuselage and try and find the tail section.
They were in the tree that the kids passed.
They found 7 bodies across 3.5 miles from the wreck site itself. Some of them were still strapped into their seats, and at least one of them appeared to have still been alive when the seat hit the ground.
Oh.
But wasn't anymore. Residents in the area were able to see as helicopters lifted bodies from the ground into the helicopters, because again, these are areas that it wasn't easy to get the car into. So they would strap them under the helicopter and lift them into the helicopter and then take them to the morgue. The CAB investigation team arrives and starts to process the scene that afternoon. This is now May 23rd. It's pretty quickly apparent that despite the initial thoughts and a lot of the thoughts of the public, this was not the result of weather or a malfunction with the plane. This was almost certainly some kind of sabotage. Dun, dun, dun.
The plot thickens.
The scene by this point has hundreds of workers. Nearby farms are opening their homes for personnel to use for bathrooms and telephones. Nearly all the hotels in all the surrounding towns are full, and a call goes out to all of the locals to see if anybody's willing to put people up so that they can continue to work and not have to drive these long distances. Almost everyone who is asked opens up their home. So we now have tons of people just staying with
different time.
Yeah, very different time, but very cool.
Yeah.
I love that. The news is also starting to travel across the country. And with that, the highways are full of the curious. Looky-loos. Those morbid voyeurs. People kind of like us who would listen to this podcast, though I don't think I would go out to look at a plane crash. But, we're still a little morbid. If you're here listening, I'm sorry. You're a little morbid. And that's okay. We love you for it. So are we. The looky-loos end up causing a fair bit of havoc. This is why you shouldn't slow down to look at a train crash. You should read about it later. These people were leaving open farm gates, they were trampling fields, and with a debris field this large, they were mucking up a lot of the evidence, right? There were some that actually went so far as to steal things from victims' pockets. Because people.
Assholes.
As people. I made you happy with people opening up their homes. Now I gotta make you a little bit sad. Dr. Ritter is another World War II veteran. He was apparently in the Marines. And he was described as going drill sergeant mean on the looky-loos and scared a number of them.
Oh, that's amazing.
I love that mental image because I know exactly what that is. I know the kinds of words he used. I know the tone he used them in. And I know why it worked. And I'm not even going to attempt to recreate that because I
watch
can't.
Full Metal Jacket.
Watch Full Metal Jacket. Yep, that's what you need to do.
Does it. Perfect.
Yep, that's what it is. The flight recorder is found that morning in a wheel well. This is kind of like the black box. And it confirms that the flight was outside of the path of storms and that this definitely was not caused by weather. This basically left mechanical failure or, again, sabotage. As teams investigate the wreckage, other teams are searching for the tail section that had broken off still. The tail section was not found until 7 o'clock the night of May 23rd. So almost 24 hours after the plane crash. It was 22 hours after the plane crash that they found it. It's found in Franklin Township, Iowa, and it's in around 500 pieces. And the metal skin is curled up and all the rivets are pushed right out over most of it. So it's destroyed.
Yeah.
It's in pieces. It's not together like the front of it was. As that tail section is being investigated, by the FAA, the CAB, the Continental Investigation, and the FBI, all of them notice that there's a very distinctive smoke smell that smells like fireworks through most of the tail section pieces, and that the bulges look like they're curling outwards.
Yeah, explosion.
So they're not, that's exactly what it is. Once Mark Felt is informed of this, he realizes that the FBI is needed for more than identification and helping organize what's going on. They're needed to investigate a crime. This is a over state lines crime, and the FBI needs to kind of shift their focus to that.
Yeah, they're not providing support anymore. It's an investigation.
Yep. There's also some waxy paper that looks and feels a lot like dynamite wrapping that is found throughout the pieces of tail section. See where we're going here?
Yep.
See where we're going?
I do.
On May 24th, there's 254. So this is second day.
Okay.
250 volunteers spread out looking for one missing body. They have found 44 of the 45 victims of the plane, and there's one left that they have not found yet. She is not found until 3:25 p.m. on May 24th. She's found not far from the other victims who had fallen from the tail section, and her name was Martha Joyce Rush. She was still strapped into her seat, but her face and skull were crushed, and she had heavy burns over one side of her body, particularly on one arm. The people who were looking for her were made up of a lot of high school students who had volunteered.
Oh.
Yeah. And these students were told after they found the body to go down to the local gas station and buy whatever they wanted on the police officers, which I thought was sweet and horrific at the same time.
Yeah.
During her autopsy, a lot more of that waxy brownish beige paper that looked an awful lot like dynamite wrapping was found embedded in her arm.
Oh, God.
Yeah. She was not the only victim with things like this. There were others that were found with explosive residue and powder burns on their bodies. So it's looking more and more like some kind of explosion happened. Ultimately, the FBI decides to recreate the tail section using chicken wire and a wooden frame to kind of recreate what happened and get a better idea of exactly what went on there. It was really clear really quickly that there was a hole coming out the side of the right lavatory that an explosion had caused from inside of the plane. In addition to the pieces of dynamite wrapping found, it was concluded that with this, that someone had stuck dynamite probably either in the toilet or in the towel rack, lit it, and it went off.
Yeah.
And that's what ultimately caused the crash. In the building where this reconstruction was happening, they also had a number of the victims' personal effects. And there's a description in one of the books I read about all of the shoes that came off in the crash being lined up in this building along a shelf. And that really stuck with me and made me think of like the Holocaust Museum and just in general how awful it is. These shoes just sitting there waiting to be like stepped back in by people that are never going to walk again, that are never going to step back into their shoes again.
It's an eerie image.
Very eerie, very just haunting.
Yeah.
Very haunting. By May 26th, statements are going out to the press, including the words explosion. The first one that came out that let the press know that this was not, a run-of-the-mill, the plane crashed, I guess, was, quote, CAB air safety investigators have determined an explosive force of unknown origin occurred within the aft portion of the fuselage and caused the aircraft to break apart in flight. Yeah. The FBI at this point is looking into who, if anyone, was heavily insured on the flight. Because like we mentioned earlier, life insurance scams were a big thing in the 60s.
Ah, yes. Who bought the most insurance?
Who had the most insurance?
Who went to the vending machine?
Exactly right. It was quickly figured out that there were two people in particular that were very heavily insured in this flight. One of them was a woman named Geneva Opal Frawley, and she had $75,000 worth of insurance. And she was traveling with a man named Thomas G. Dottie. He had $300,000 worth of insurance on his name for just this flight alone. He bought a $50,000 policy 4 days before the crash, $75,000 the day of the crash, and another $225,000 the day before. All of them with the beneficiary listed as his wife, Naomi Dottie. Yeah. So we have some suspicions at this point.
Yeah, we have a front runner.
Dottie was Thomas G. Dottie was born on April 17th, 1928. This all kind of came out in the FBI investigation. He had a wife, Naomi, a 5-year-old daughter, and his wife was 7.5 months pregnant with their second child. He was diagnosed with diabetes when he was a teenager, and by most accounts, he really didn't seem to manage his condition well. He had comas. He had just general issues going on that a lot of the stuff I read said he probably didn't manage his condition well. A lot of his doctors said he probably didn't manage it well, and I think that's entirely possible, but it's also possible that, diabetes management wasn't great in the 60s. Yeah. We didn't have as good of healthcare as not healthcare, but we didn't have as good of medicines for these kind of conditions then as we do now. So I take that with a grain of salt, but it definitely impacted his life in a lot of ways. He was not a healthy man. He did a lot, but he wasn't healthy. On April 23rd, 1962, so just about a month before this crash happened, he was arrested.
Oh.
He was arrested for strong arm robbery, vagrancy, and carrying a concealed weapon. Basically, he was accused of robbing this woman at gunpoint. He was due to appear in court on May 25th, so 3 days, after this crash happened. Dottie had claimed that he didn't assault or rob the woman. His claim was that he had been drinking, but he wasn't drunk, and he was feeling sick, and then he found a purse on the sidewalk.
Okay.
And she was making the rest of it up, which just sounds to me like someone making shit up. But I don't know. You know, he never ended up having his day in court. He was just accused, and that was his defense. He said that he didn't do it. We need to mention it. In the months and weeks leading up to the crash, however, Dottie had checked out a number of different books on explosives. The FBI talked to his wife. She talked about how he was looking into these kinds of things. They went to all of the libraries his wife had mentioned and took the books that he had, you know, it was shown to have checked out. They checked them for fingerprints. His wife also reported seeing something that was redacted by the FBI files in his briefcase that was found amongst the debris, among this, 40 miles worth of debris field. And she said, well, the way it looks like she said she saw dynamite in his briefcase, but it was redacted, so I don't know for sure.
What were redacted from, like, she saw the FBI's report and it was redacted in there and she said, no, I saw dynamite.
I'm a nerd, so I read the FBI report. They redacted what exactly she said she saw in his briefcase. Okay. And the way it reads, it looks to me like it probably said dynamite. But I don't know for
why
sure.
They would redact that. That's interesting.
In other parts, she talked about seeing explosives and dynamite in the trunk of his car. So I think that's what it said. But I don't know for sure. She saw something that concerned the FBI that was redacted in their report that was released later. Dottie was also identified as having purchased dynamite from the Atlas Company Explosives Division in Delaware. The evidence from the crash didn't totally match up with that evidence. The Atlas Dynamite Company, their wax wrapping that went around dynamite had blue lettering. The lettering that was found on that waxy paper in the plane crash was black. Okay. And there was a couple of other minor differences between the Atlas Company and what was found at the crash site. So the FBI concluded that there was some reasonable doubt, and it remained unclear if the dynamite that was used on the crash was the same kind of dynamite that Thomas Dottie bought.
Okay. But I mean, guys looking up books on explosives.
There's a lot of evidence.
He's buying dynamite. He's buying tons of life insurance. And his life doesn't seem to be going well.
Right. There's a lot of problems. His wife also did mention seeing explosives in his car, what she thought were explosives in his trunk. Jean Frawley ultimately was pretty cleared. She also had quite a bit of insurance, and she was starting up a business with Dottie. There was some rumors that there was an affair going on there as well that were unfounded, but they were there. The FBI ultimately was like, I don't think she was involved in this. I think she was a victim. And then she went with Dottie, and she ultimately just had a really bad day here. The ultimate probable cause from the FBI report said that the probable cause of this accident was disintegrating force of a dynamite explosion, which occurred in the right rear lavatory, resulting in the destruction of the aircraft from unknown origins. So it was dynamite. We're not sure if it was Thomas Dottie, but we're pretty sure it was Thomas Dottie.
Yeah.
If there had been a trial, I could see Thomas Dottie getting off for reasonable doubt. I could see it. Because there isn't a lot of definitive connecting evidence between him and the dynamite. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence. True. And I mean, if you ask me what I think he's probably the one who did it. But is it conclusive?
To get the life insurance money.
The life insurance money, the fact that he was due to appear in court a few days later. His wife was pregnant. He was trying to get her taken care of. He told her at one point, I forget exactly what the quote was because I didn't write it down, but essentially, I'll off myself in a way that no one will know before I bring you more trouble. Yeah. In regards to, because she was worried about her kid being teased if it came out that he got arrested. And he was like, don't worry, I'll off myself in a way that no one will know before I let my little girl get teased. So, I mean, if you're asking me, I think it was Dottie.
I think
it was.
I think that's a pretty shitty, cowardly way to do.
Horrible. 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 But it's not
people with you.
He did. I mean, whoever did this is a terrible fucking person. I think it's important this man never had his day in court.
Fair enough.
There is some reasonable doubt. And I think it's important just from the standpoint of, I don't ever want to be the person super pushing conspiracy theories and saying these other things. So I'll tell you, I think it was probably Dottie. Is it conclusive? Is it for sure? No. It's
sure. Innocent until proven guilty.
Yep.
I can get behind that.
But I think it was Dottie.
Regardless, like you said, whoever did this is a shitty fucking person.
Absolute shitbag.
They took everyone else with them.
But you know who they didn't take? Are you
Who?
ready to get to this? Because remember I said there were no human survivors.
Were there snakes on the plane?
There weren't. For once, the dog lived.
The dog lived!
Now, we don't know whose dog it was. And it's not even 100% sure that this dog was on the plane. But throughout the course of them going through the wreckage and identifying the bodies, there was this German Shepherd that had this big gash. I know, like our Dante. We had a beautiful German Shepherd for years. He was Aaron's best friend.
Oh, yeah.
His name was Dante von Solomon. We love German Shepherds here. But there was a German Shepherd that had a big cut on his chin that was just happily trying to talk to everyone as they were going through the wreckage.
Good boy.
And everyone thinks he came from the plane. There was a dog crate that was opened up, found amongst the wreckage.
Okay.
There's this dog found amongst the wreckage.
The only other option is this poor dog is just in the field when this plane comes down around him.
I actually hadn't thought about that, but yeah, that could have been it. But no, they found a dog crate in the wreckage. So
yeah,
that
makes sense.
This dog was given to Robert, who is the little boy that climbed on that plane wing and saw the pilot. And he named the dog Boeing 707.
Oh.
I know. But I'm so sorry. I literally cried when I read this. Someone stole the dog less than a year after he was given.
Who steals a fucking dog?
Don't even know. I yelled at my computer screen and then I actually shed a tear, which I felt even worse about because I didn't shed a tear over the victim.
People, but dog.
I shed a tear over the dog being stolen from this little traumatized boy losing his fucking dog.
I mean, it's the insult to injury.
It is.
But also, who the fuck steals a dog?
Assholes.
Don't
There's a lot of assholes in this
touch
story.
The dog.
I could not believe that.
Yeah, just insult to injury. That's just
so
messed up.
Yeah, very messed up. The news of the crash was pushed out to the media quickly throughout the course of them figuring all this stuff out. It was out there from the moment it crashed to them starting to put together this recreation of the tail section, the FBI coming out, all these different things. But it ended up being pushed out of the media even more quickly. The first thing that started to push it out of the media was a man named Gano Smith. Gano Smith lived in the same area of this plane crash. And a couple of days after the crash happened on May 27th, he murdered 5 people in his family, his aunt, his uncle, and 3 cousins, and then went on the fucking run. So we've got a whole ass plane crash in the area and a mass murderer on the loose running around. Iowa, Missouri was not great.
Yeah.
They weren't having a good year.
No.
He wasn't found until 4 days later. So they're looking for all of these different things. They're trying to process this huge scene while farmers are out on their land carrying shotguns and pistols just in case the mass murderer tries to come by their home. It was bananas out there.
Wow.
The reason he was found is because locals, the same ones who helped with this search and all of these different things, came up with a plan to release all of their foxhounds at the same time. And they were hoping that the barking from the foxhounds would make him think that bloodhounds had found his trail and force him to move from wherever he was hiding. And it worked. He was hiding in this little barn, and when he heard all of these different foxhounds going on, he snuck out and ran to another barn. And one of the local farmers found his trail of footprints and called the police, and they were able to track and capture him in this barn. So he was ferreted out by foxhounds, which I just thought was fantastic.
Pretty awesome, actually.
Right? And then 12 days later, Air France 07 crashed in Paris, killing 122 people with only 2 survivors on June 3rd, 1962.
So the more sensational, bigger death toll.
I don't know if it's necessarily more sensational, but definitely a bigger death toll. And again, even now, I mean, especially now, news media moves quickly, but even then, news media, there's a new thing. Thing. This one happened in France, and it was another Boeing 707, because of course it was.
Right.
This one was caused by a motor failure that prevented the proper rotation and takeoff. So it went kind of up and then crashed back down and blew up. Really
Oh,
quite bananas. This was the worst single aircraft disaster that had happened up until that point as well in terms of death toll. On top of that, most of the victims on the plane were from Atlanta. So
what?
it would make sense that it would like be big news in Europe, but the reason it was big news over here in the States is because most of them were from Atlanta. There's a group in France, a group of really prominent art collectors from Atlanta that were touring different art museums.
Uh-huh.
So it was a bunch of rich hoity-toity artsy people who blew up on this plane, which big news.
Yeah, big news.
The wreck didn't start being removed until mid-June from Shuey Field.
Oh my God.
Don Shuey was one of the only people to receive any kind of compensation for the crash. His alfalfa field wouldn't be usable for 5 years due to jet fuel permeating the soil.
Oh, wow.
Almost no one else got any kind of compensation. And this is not because people are terrible. This is because not many people thought to seek compensation because the plane was blown up by a douchebag.
Yeah.
And they didn't think it was Continental Airlines' fault because, it wasn't their fault.
Yeah, they didn't have the guy. Unless.
And also.
Conspiracy theory, unless. Just kidding.
And also, I think there's a big component here of this was the Champagne flight. Now, not all of the families were doing all right after this, but most of them had the financial means to be okay with losing these members of their family. Not, emotionally okay, but financially okay.
Right.
So there wasn't as much of a need to pursue compensation as there is in other cases. So that is the full story. Over the years, pieces of the wreck would continue to be found, whether it was bits of metal that were brought up when the land was plowed, or even things like a keychain from a victim that was found years later in the woods.
Ooh.
Since the 707 started being used, there has been a total of 217 listed accidents that include things like bombings, pilot errors, really anything, with a total of 3,176 fatalities.
That's
on just
a lot.
Boeing 707s alone.
Huh.
Boeing's been fucked up since day one. I mean, I'm sorry, they weren't really fucked up back then, but it was bananas to me that Boeing has had such a dark history. I guess it's just airlines, but given today's news in the world, knowing that Boeing, just the one 707, over 3,000 people have died on that one type of plane alone.
I mean, did
bonkers.
Did they get better for a while?
It did. So if you look at the end of 1950s through the 1970s, there's tons. Most of the accidents are in that time frame. There's more in the 1980s than the 1990s, and every year it goes down. By the 2020s, 2010 to 2025, there's only 2, which is both because the 707 isn't being used that much anymore.
Yeah.
And because things are getting better. But you could see there's a steep drop off. And the jet age, I mean, there's a reason people were apprehensive. There was a lot of accidents. It was a new technology. And they were figuring things out. And also, we were figuring out how to fly safely and not let people be douchebags and blow up planes. We were still figuring that stuff out. Technology was very much viewed as a double-edged sword, the same way it is today, but even more so then. This is the time when John Glenn's flight was showcasing how crazy awesome technology was. And all of these plane crashes were showing how scary it can be. There's a lot of dichotomy there. In 1962 alone, there were 5 Boeing 707 crashes that killed a total of 481 people.
In 1 year.
In 1 year. The Flight 11 was actually the smallest death toll of all 5.
Right. Hadn't you said that 707 had been blown up with dynamite prior?
Yep.
As well?
But that was in the 50s. That wasn't in 1962. But yes, it had been. There's a lot of bad things. And that one, I don't know that one was in flight. I think that one was still on land when it was blown up. But I mean, I think it still counts. It got blown up. Thing. So this disaster inspired the book Airport.
Really?
Yep. By Arthur Haley in 1968. Arthur Haley was a newsaholic. And that story is about a airline that gets a bomb put on it mid-flight and they try and blow it up or whatever. But no one ends up dying in that story. And that story ended up being made into the movie Airplane, which has my great respect and joy because it really spawned the disaster genre of movies. and it's just fantastic. If you've never seen it, you should watch that 1970s movie. It has Dean Martin in it. It's great. It's got 3 sequels, all of which are awesome. They're progressively less awesome than the first one because that's how movies work.
Yeah.
In my research here, like I said, this is a pretty kind of forgotten disaster. Part of how it started coming back into our consciousness was this kid in New Zealand. He's not a kid anymore. This man in New Zealand. His name is Andrew Russell.
Okay.
In 2008, he created a blog titled What Happened to Continental Airlines Flight 11. And he really just had genuine curiosity, trying to understand what was going on. And the internet did what it does best when it's at its best. Some of the people from this area found the blog. They all started talking. Things started moving forward. They were able to eventually get a memorial created in large part because of Andrew Russell. Andrew Russell wrote a book called The Missouri Crash, which is one of the main references I used for this podcast. That's really, really well done. Andrew Russell was also the keynote speaker when they put up that monument.
Oh, cool.
The monument has Thomas Dottie's name on it, which I thought was kind of bananas. It's this big granite, just like tombstone almost, with all the names of the victim on it on the Putnam Courthouse yard. Beautiful, beautiful monument. But I thought it was interesting that Thomas Dottie was on it. Because again, like I said, we don't know for sure that he's the one who blew it up.
True.
And he did pass away in this. So it's there. I love Andrew Russell, though. Seems like a really cool guy. I love all the work he's done on this. The blog is really interesting. It's going to be linked in the show notes. And the other book I read was by Enfys McMurray, and she wrote a book called Disaster at 39,000 Feet. And I listened to an interview of her, and she is just like one of my favorite people now. She's so adorable. She's from Wales, and she clearly just adores this information. So I hope I did her proud because I really loved her book, and I loved Andrew Russell's book, and I love how much attention they've brought to this. We've done a lot of disasters that people know about, and we've done a few that people don't know a ton about, but I think this is the first one that's really quite forgotten. And the amount of work that they've done to bring it back to the public's attention is the only reason I know it exists, and so many other people know it exists. And that's an important thing. This was a big deal. This is an interesting disaster. It's an important disaster, and I appreciate their work. And so hopefully I did them proud. Hopefully we did them proud. I'm a little bit more spicy than either one of them are, so I don't know. But fingers crossed. I love you guys. I love your work. And that is the story of Continental Airlines Flight 11. It's a big one.
Yeah, that's a story.
It's a crazy story. It's a movie.
It is.
This is one I would really love to see as a movie because I think it would be an absolutely fantastic one. And if done right, it could do a lot of honor to the victims and would just be really, really cool to watch. I mean, between the Thomas Dottie things and just the 60s, and it's the champagne flight and oh my God, Frank Gray with his little carnation. His daughter ended up bringing a carnation to the memorial unveiling for her father, which I thought was really beautiful. And then the dog.
The dog.
But if they make the movie, don't let the dog get stolen.
Yeah. Or have some justice. Dog napper. Oh, fuck you. We get so enraged by the dog.
What's the name of that bounty hunter? Dog hunter.
Dog.
Was it?
Dog the bounty hunter.
Dog the bounty hunter. That's what it was. Dog the bounty hunter needs to go find the dog.
That was a great story. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Do you have any questions about it? Anything
stuck
out to you?
I asked my questions and you answered them well.
Did anything stick out to you?
My mind keeps going back to the flash of light and the boom in the sky. And,
how jarring.
Yeah, and clearly, dynamite exploding, blowing up the back of the plane.
But it was also on the tail end of a number of spring storms, so a lot of people really did just kind of brush it off as like, oh, it's just stray lightning.
Yeah,
Make you think twice about lightning next time you see it.
Yeah. No, that was a really good story, and I know more now.
I wish you could see the look that I'm giving him. The eyebrow in the air.
I do also love how you showcased how this whole community, these two communities, really came together and came out to join together for this search and opening up their homes, and just there weren't a lot of questions. It was just like, yeah,
we're there. We're there.
Let's do this. There's something going on. We need to.
It's one of the parts I found most beautiful about this story, and one of the things that really connected me to it in a time of, like we talked about, so much apprehension and fear and just changes in the United States. There were still areas where people, they didn't think twice. They just jumped up and they helped. And I think that's really amazing and important to showcase. Because, you know, when you're doing these things, you have to pick and choose. Not everything can make it into the podcast.
Were there concerns about the communists? Maybe it was a communist strike.
Probably, but not anything I read referenced that. But I'm sure there were some concerns about that, especially once they realized it was an explosion. Though I think they found the life insurance on Thomas Dottie quickly enough to know. There were probably concerns that Thomas Dottie was a communist, but
maybe that's what was redacted.
Maybe that's what was redacted. There was a lot redacted in the FBI report.
Really?
It was difficult to read, and I like reading those things because I'm nerdy. But it was difficult to make my way through with a number of redactions. But we did it. We made it. And it was worth it. So yeah, that is our full story. Next week, we're going to be doing our first listener request, which I'm pretty excited about.
I am super excited.
It's going to be a really fun one. It involves coal miners in a war, or an uprising anyway, a rebellion. I love rebellions. I love a rebel. So that'll be a really fun one. And with that, we have socials. Follow us on social media. Arin doesn't do the social media. If you go on social media, it's me. Arin likes looking at the social media, and he tells me what a good job I'm doing. Arin's amazing. I love him. Thank you, Arin. You're the best. We have TikTok. We have Instagram. We have X. We have Threads. We have Blue Sky. We have Facebook. We have all of them. We also have email. Feel free to email us at catastrophechroniclespod@gmail.com. The website is www.catastrophe-chronicles.com, and that has our pod blog, which has all of our show notes, pictures, different things in there. We have a tip jar in the show notes and connected to most of our social medias and the website. Feel free to financially help contribute to the pod. Help us maybe pay for a babysitter. You probably can't hear it in this. Hopefully you can't hear it in this, but the number of times we've had to pause tonight to wrangle video game playing children was unholy.
Oh my goodness.
Super funny though. And with that,
stay safe, everyone.
And stay curious.